how could you look at this case of Matthew being horrifyingly tortured and say, that was an adequate response to his sexual orientation. I would have done the same thing by tying him up to a fence post. It's an absolutely ridiculous argument, and I refuse to accept it.
On this episode of Transition Virginia, Delegate Danica Roem.
I'm from the underground. I was directly elected from the underground.
We talk about her bill outlawing the panic defense.
It's a patently BS argument that I absolutely refuse to accept.
And the politics of hate crimes.
The General Assembly has more drama than a high school theater class.
Plus, we talk about Metallica.
I am not a casual heavy metal fan.
All that and so much more on this episode of Transition Virginia.
Introducing touch-free payments from PayPal, a safe way for your customers to pay. Simply download the PayPal app and display your own unique QR code for your customers to scan. Whether you're a market seller,
I'll take 2 tomatoes and a cucumber,
poodle pamperer, piano tuner, or plumber. Signing up to accept touch-free payments for your business is easy. Touch-free QR code payments. Shop safe with PayPal.
Welcome to Transition Virginia, the podcast that examines the ongoing transition of power in Virginia politics. My name is Michael Pope.
And I'm Thomas Bowman. Today on the podcast, expanding protections for LGBTQ plus Virginians. What happens when crimes are committed against people because of their gender identity or their sexual orientation? Can a victim's gender identity or sexual identity be used as a defense in court?
Or what about a person's perceived gender identity or perceived sexual orientation? Sometimes a crime is not based on reality, it's based on perceptions. And sometimes the defense of a crime is based on the panic about learning of someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. These are all gray areas in Virginia's law.
And we have a really amazing guest to help us understand these issues. We're joined by the first transgender member of the House of Delegates, a heavy metal enthusiast who spent a career as a journalist before running for office. Delegate Danica Roem, thanks for joining us.
It's great to be here. Thank you so much.
Delegate Roem, we're going to talk about your bill to abolish the panic defense, and we're also going to talk about a bill introduced by Senator Ghazala Hashmi, a bill that expands the definition of what a hate crime is. Plus, later in the show, we're going to talk heavy metal, and we're going to rank all the Metallica albums.
Michael wanted to do a show only on Metallica.
Thomas wisely talked me out of that. And then, Delegate Roem, I saw your bill on panic defense, which is fascinating. So let's start with that. Now, for listeners who want to hear about Metallica, stick around for segment 3 of the podcast. And I promise you, we're going to talk about all of the Metallica albums later. But we're going to start with House Bill 2132, a bill that you introduced, Delegate Roem, to abolish the panic defense in Virginia. Now, I can hear many listeners sort of thinking to themselves, panic defense, what the heck is that? Delegate Roem, what is the panic defense and how did this bill come about?
All right, so I'll answer that second question first, and then we'll get back to the first. So the bill actually came as an idea from one of my constituents in Manassas Park, who's a student who's out, who sent me an email during the summer of 2020, basically saying, hey, could you please file a bill to do this because this is, horrible. And as for just talking about what the panic defense actually does, basically what happens is that someone will use your sexual orientation or gender identity as the provocation for why they attacked you in a heat of passion rage. And then not only is that what they'll say provoked them to attack you, but that it excuses their attack. And so rather than deem it with malicious intent, aka, murder, they will say that it was more or less accidental. I was in a fit of rage because I couldn't possibly help myself. You would understand if you were in my shoes too, wouldn't you? At which point they can get their sentences reduced, or they can be sentenced for manslaughter instead of murder 2 charge. And since the most high profile case happened to be Matthew Sheperd, I think that one resonates in people's minds so much, and that if you can understand the horror of the torture that poor soul endured in that rural area in Laramie, Wyoming, when he was pistol whipped, drug out to a fence post and tied up and left to die. It's just, what was his crime? It was for existing as a gay man in rural Wyoming.
In court, the murderers of Matthew Sheperd tried to argue that the reason they committed the crime was the sexual orientation of the victim. This is sort of classic blaming the victim. Now, one of the people supporting your bill, Delegate Roem, is Judy Sheperd, the mother of Matthew Sheperd and the founder of the Matthew Sheperd Foundation. She testified in favor of your bill when it was before the Criminal Subcommittee of the Courts of Justice, and here is a bit of her testimony.
The panic defense relies on ugly stigmas, particular to the LGBTQ people, to justify horrific violence against LGBTQ plus individuals. When a perpetrator uses the LGBTQ plus panic defense, they are claiming that the victim's sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression not only explains but excuses the loss of self-control and subsequent violent assault or murder. Under the LGBTQ plus panic defense, a hate crime victim's very identity simultaneously becomes the reason for their murder and the exoneration of their murderer.
Now, after she finished testifying, the chairman of the subcommittee, Delegate Mike Mullen, said this was some of the most powerful testimony he's ever heard in his career. Delegate Roem, what was it like for you to hear Judy Sheperd testifying in support of your bill?
Well, in the run-up to, that testimony, we had heard about a week and a half, 2 weeks ahead of time that she was going to be willing to testify. And I told the subcommittee chairman, Mike Mullen, who is also one of the chief co-patrons of the bill, by the way, I was like, just so you know, we have Judy Sheperd testifying. And his reaction was just, oh, wow. And I was like, it's quite possible that there's not going to be a dry eye in the room. So just so we understand that when you do have someone of the caliber of Judy Sheperd, who is, testifying for a bill in Virginia, it should speak to the volume of importance about what this means and why this is important. At that point, just to use another journalism axios, we always say, show, don't tell. Well, I don't have to tell you that bill's important when Judy Sheperd is speaking in favor of it. That should tell you everything.
I wasn't necessarily planning to make an announcement, but since the Sheperd Foundation has been invoked, I should probably disclose that as of this past week, my own firm, Resolute Strategies Group, just signed the former Matthew Sheperd Foundation CEO, Jason Marsden, to our firm. So we're expanding our footprint, and he brings a lot to the table. But breaking news and a disclosure. So anyway, Delegate Roem, your bill had many people testify in favor, including the Office of Attorney General Mark Herring, the Commonwealth's Attorney for Prince William County, and the National LGBT Bar Association. But it also has some critics. Doug Ramser at the Virginia Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers said categorical bans on potential defenses are not a good way to protect the LGBTQ plus community.
Every case is different, and we need to resist the impulse to prohibit a defense because we find it distasteful. And while there have been plenty of examples of things happening in other states, we're not aware of examples in Virginia where this has become a problem.
What do you make of those two arguments, Danica? It hasn't happened here, and it's generally a bad idea to take any legal defense off the table. Does this infringe on defendants' ability to mount a defense?
Number one, no, it doesn't. Number two, it has happened in Virginia. And when I was in subcommittee, I was reeling out the list of, cities where just based on my own team's research, we found, whether it was in Norfolk or Williamsburg, Hampton, just like, trust me, it happens in Virginia. I wouldn't have brought the bill forward if, this was not a problem in Virginia. And the third part on this about, is it a bad idea to, take any legal defense off the table? Well, we already do take a legal defense off the table with bribery. You can't say, oh, I was bribed, so I'm absolved now. And then in regard to this defense, keep in mind, you are saying that someone's sexual orientation and gender identity in and of itself, without any person attacking, without someone, going up and throwing a fist or drawing a gun or anything like that, that mere existence of someone's sexual orientation or gender identity is reason for you to kill them or maim them and then be excused for doing it. It's a patently BS argument that I absolutely refuse to accept. And so this bill makes that explicitly clear. And the problem is that there are unfortunately too many places throughout, America, quite frankly, where a judge could hear that sort of transphobic or homophobic argument and be like, oh, okay, yeah, I would have a similar reaction if one of them showed up in front of me, or if they talked to my daughter, or just like some stupid thing like that. That's real. That is extremely real. And the last thing on this is, how could you possibly look at the Matthew Sheperd case, if nothing else, just to go with the one that we all know about, as opposed to the plethora of others to choose from here? How could you look at this case of Matthew being horrifyingly tortured and say, that was an adequate response to his sexual orientation. I would have done the same thing by tying him up to a fence post. It's an absolutely ridiculous argument, and I refuse to accept it.
Now, when your bill came before the Criminal Justice Subcommittee, there was some wordsmithing when the committee members were doing kind of a technical change here, and it led to this really interesting interchange. I want to play this and get your reaction to it. Here's Delegate Mike Mullen asking you if this technical tweak was okay with you.
Sounds like everyone's in favor of it. Delegate Roem, are you all right?
Yeah, I mean, other than being emotionally crushed by, having to think back to being 14 years old and being scared to come out because of Matthew's murder. Other than that, yeah, I'm very okay right now, if not completely devastated and heartbroken.
Delegate Roem, what was happening here? Talk about your experience as a 14-year-old learning about the death of Matthew Sheperd and what that moment means for you now.
Well, what's funny was when I heard, Delegate Mullen's question to me of, are you all right? I literally thought he was asking about my emotional state of being at the time, not in the context of the technical amendment. And so it was a very honest answer to the question, are you all right? But it wasn't exactly like in context of what he was asking, though. In hindsight, I was like, oh, and then if you were to play the rest of the audio, you would have heard him say like, oh, we're talking about the amendment. Oh yeah, that's fine. Sorry. So yeah, that was just a misunderstanding on my part. But although hey, I appreciate it in any event. What I do remember though was having a very thorough understanding that for me to come out at that age would have resulted in isolation, having no friends anywhere, because there were in the entire time I was in high school, I knew of one out gay person, one, through 4 years, and he wasn't in my grade. He was a couple years ahead of me. Now I know like 7 people who I went to school with who have come out since graduating, and some of whom actually, have like, same-sex spouses and everything. And so I found it was kind of funny that the way we kind of are today is who I think we would have wanted our high school selves to know that we could become. But at the same time, I also think that it speaks volumes to how scary that time was, in Virginia. And people sometimes will say like, oh, well, is Virginia really part of the South? Well, other than the fact that I represent the first battlefield of this, American Civil War in my district, Battle of Manassas, I have to emphatically say that, like, yes, culturally and geographically, yes, we are. And on top of that, ask any out person in the late 90s who was living in Virginia whether they thought Virginia was just this bastion of progressivism. And you're not going to find a lot of people who are going to, tell you, oh, yeah, everything was just swimmingly going great. It wasn't. And I know that when Matthew got killed, it was one of those things where you look at it and you go, oh yeah, that could have happened here, and not even thought twice about it. Absolutely, that could have happened in Virginia. And quite frankly, it still could. It's just that now Virginia has gotten to a point where culturally, the shift that has happened in the most populous areas especially is one where it's a lot more welcoming and warm toward inclusivity. And because of our population growth, and when you have density to go with that population, you have more people getting to know more people from more walks of life. And so in that regard, our population is a lot less homogenous than it used to be. And that means that people are used to diversity at a different level now than they used to be. That is not universal throughout Virginia, though. And that's not to have a just volley of criticisms toward rural areas, because that certainly happens in cities and suburbs as well. Like, let's get real. But I do think it speaks to the idea that where we were when I was a 14-year-old freshman who very much knew that I was trans and queer, but was mortified to tell anyone. I think our society's changed a lot, but that internalized fear is very much still present. Otherwise, my constituent from Manassas Park wouldn't have been sending me that email asking for this bill in the first place.
Well, Delegate Roem, the 14-year-old Michael Pope is really excited. We're talking about Metallica later in this podcast. But first, when we come back from the commercial break, we're going to talk about a similar bill to the one we were just talking about over on the Senate side that expands what counts as a hate crime.
And I'll tell you what doesn't help is when we have reporters like Michael Pope from WVTF. These were not rioters and looters. These were patriots. I never called the people who stormed the Capitol patriots. These were not rioters and looters. These were patriots. I never called the people who stormed the Capitol patriots. We have to hold our media accountable.
You can help our podcast hold people in power accountable. Head over to transitionvirginia.com and hit the button that says Contribute on Patreon. For as little as $3 a month, you can help us speak truth to power. And we're back on Transition Virginia. We're talking with Delegate Danica Roem about legislation aimed at expanding protections for LGBTQ plus Virginians. And I want to talk a bill that's already been killed this session, a bill that was introduced by Senator Ghazala Hashmi of Richmond. She introduced a bill after being approached by Henrico County Commonwealth's Attorney Shannon Taylor, who wanted to prosecute a hate crime, but she was having a hard time with how Virginia law works. Now, at issue here in this case was an incident where a white guy assaulted someone at a Black Lives Matter rally. Now, Shannon Taylor wanted to prosecute the assault as a hate crime, but there was a problem because the victim was white.
We were unable to make an argument to the court that just because the race of both parties was the same, that did not mean that we should not be focusing on the intent of the defendant, because our current law looks more at the victim and the victim's characteristics than it does looking at the offender and his intent.
Oh, and there's also this to consider about the guy who assaulted the BLM protester.
This offender was a member of the Ku Klux Klan, and the ideology regarding the Klan is about white purity. And that if you associate yourself with anybody who is not white, not part of the Klan, you are less than them.
Now, senators rejected this idea. They rejected the idea that someone's association could be used to prosecute someone for a hate crime. Here's Senator Chap Peterson of Fairfax City.
It seems to me this would sweep up almost 95% of crimes. For example, there could have been vandalism in the city of Richmond this summer that was directed at some businesses because of the perceived association of that owner. They may have been perceived as being white. So I think before you change this statute in this massive way, to me, you're getting pretty far afield from the original purpose, but that's just my opinion.
Now, Senator Peterson's view was the prevailing opinion, and the committee killed Ghazala Hashmi's bill. Delegate Roem, what would you say to Senator Peterson and others who were concerned that extending a hate crime to someone's association with a protected group, that's a bridge too far?
Well, I guess the first thing that I would say, first off, I've had a really good working relationship with Senator Peterson, especially when we've been dealing with Dominion issues, for example, over the last few years. So like I understand that Senator Peterson is not coming from this issue from a place of malice where, I've been in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee enough times to know that they really, really pour over the words, and they're just trying to poke holes in your argument to make sure it's legally sound. So I understand where Senator Peterson's coming from. I signed on, to help support this bill because I also very much understood where Senator Hashmi as well as Commonwealth's Attorney Taylor were coming from this. And what they were really trying to get at here is saying, like, look, the intent of a Ku Klux Klan member, trying to get someone killed is not something that they were doing because, they were just like, oh man, you really got me angry because you cut in front of me at 7-Eleven or something. Like when someone is being targeted in this case for their association with an ideology or association with a protest, right? That you were targeting that person at that point for their identity via association.
So what do you make of Senator Peterson's comment here that this change would sweep up 95% of crimes?
Well, I mean, I think that was probably hyperbolic, and that's okay. It's like I understand that he was just trying to make a larger point. At the same time, I also just have a difference of opinion and different view than he does. And, he's an attorney. I'm not, but, I also did cover a lot of cops, crimes, and court sort of stuff, even though that wasn't my primary beat. So I just have a difference of opinion and hopefully be able to hash that out and get some better next year.
The Senate hearing also had a pretty dramatic moment that I want to get your take on, Delegate Roem. It all started when Senator Joe Morrissey said it's offensive that advocates for this bill are wrapping it up in Black Lives Matter.
That's like me going down to a gay pride parade, and I see another white male there, and I get into a fight with him for reasons entirely unrelated to gay pride. I am going to be prosecuted for a hate crime because I'm associated with a gay pride parade. And that's what's going on here. And I got to tell you, I am offended that folks brought this and then wrap it up in BLM and suggest that if we vote against it, somehow we're not supporting the prosecution of hate crimes, because that's not what we're doing.
Okay, that outrageous comment from Morrissey prompted Senator Hashmi to say this.
You're speaking from a position of privilege if you see it in that context.
Oh,
because
my
this
God.
Now, that triggered this mansplaining from Republican Senate Leader Tommy Normant.
I've got to tell you, I take extraordinary exception in anyone, regardless of how much respect I have for them, suggesting that because I disagree with them, that I am speaking from a position of privilege. And I say, if I am privileged, it's only because I have something of a legal training and a lot of experience in litigating cases that gives me a little more insightful perspective on what's required on a burden of proof.
How much more privileged can you be than being on the board of a bank? But okay. Was Senator Morrissey speaking from a position of privilege? Why did Hashmi's comments trigger Normant like that?
So I'm a good legislator who's been very successful at passing her bills, and the state Senate did not kill any of my previous 17 bills. I have another 6 of them going over to the Senate. And just because the General Assembly has more drama than a high school theater class does not mean that I am going to do anything to subject my bills to what we will call enhanced interrogation. So I'm going to not go ahead and attack the members of the committee that I need my bills to go through and pass. I'll take a hard pass on that and just say that the Senate works in mysterious ways.
All right. Well, maybe Delegate Roem, can you explain how the bill fits in with the overall push for a more inclusive and responsive criminal justice system for diverse communities?
Yes, absolutely. So happy to talk about that. Yes. So regarding, just like that, trying to make it more inclusive, responsive, I think what we see here is that when you have underrepresentation throughout government. If you don't have a lot of people of color, you don't have a lot of people from diverse, non-homogenous backgrounds, in positions of power, not just in the Senate and the House of Delegates, but, just throughout the criminal justice system in general, then you will have a lot of issues that are going unaddressed, or because people are unaware of them, that they are having to learn on the spot, or they're not necessarily, going to be, particularly well versed on issues that affect people who are quite different from who they are. And if you think about this, how many out LGBTQ prosecutors are there in Virginia? Do you know of any?
I have no idea.
I like to think I know all the LGBTQ elected officials in Virginia, and I don't. So if you don't have that, you're not going to have a lot of people then who inherently understand that issue, right? And by the way, and I want to just say, like, when I was saying LGBTQ prosecutors, I strictly meant that in the elected way, okay? So, for example, there used to be, Tracy Thorne-Beglin, who's now a general district court, member in Richmond. He was a prosecutor before, he was tapped for that job. And there was the huge confirmation fight that my predecessor led over Tracy Thorne-Beglin, being appointed to the general district court in the first place. And then when we got to vote to reconfirm him, there was no opposition. And I had this, we'll just say Cheshire cat grin on my face as I was looking up at the scoreboard, just realizing, wow, we've really turned a corner where Tracy Thorne-Beglin's nomination is no longer a 2:30 in the morning member storming out of the House of Delegates and all this other sort of stuff. So I think, having more people who have more diverse worldviews and diverse lived experience being in positions of power, well, number one, that will diminish the argument of privilege, although it is certainly, not exclusive in that regard. But I would also say that in terms of inclusivity and just making the criminal justice system more responsive for diverse communities in general, that you will have people understanding that, yes, issues like this that we're trying to deal with are not simply one-offs, that they are systemic, and that there's a cause for why they're systemic, and that the way that we can deal with them needs to be really holistic instead of just piece by piece whenever they come up.
All right, we're going to take a break, and then when we come back, we're going to talk about Metallica.
Michael, do you ever wish you could go back and check the transcripts of our episode?
A transcript? Do you mean like the Nixon tapes?
Yeah. Now you can find the smoking gun of Virginia politics at transitionvirginia.com. Just click the link for notes and you'll see audio and now transcripts.
Well, you can search for keywords like dirty trick or onion ring.
We're building our blog to feature even more great content over the coming months.
You can find it all at transitionvirginia.com. And we're back on Transition Virginia. I was going to use some audio from a Metallica song here, but I didn't want Lars Ulrich to come after me with a lawsuit, so we're not going to do that. But we are going to talk about something that Thomas and I, when we first started talking about launching this podcast, one of my original goals was to get Danica Roem on the podcast to talk about Metallica. Now, we're going to lay the groundwork here. Some of our listeners might not know your background, Delegate Roem. Tell our listeners about your musical history with your band.
Yeah, so I was the vocalist and for the entire duration of my now former band Cab Ride Home from 2006 to 2017. For the first 3 years, I also played guitar, actually 3.5 years. I was also a rhythm guitar player. And I had a college band before that. And so we played a lot of shows. We played probably about 160 some odd shows. We, got to tour Belfast in Northern Ireland, Glasgow, Edinburgh and Aberdeen in Scotland. That was in 2012. We opened for just like a lot of really good, internationally touring metal bands. I'd say one of the highlights of that was we got to play a sold out show headlined by Amon Amarth at Jack's nightclub in West Springfield, Virginia. So, our style of music was very thrash, melodic death, kind of also, like, if you remember from the early 2000s, that like new wave of American heavy metal, like bands like Lamb of God, Chimera, Shadows Fall, who very much fell into into theirs as well, while at the same time having very blatant influences from like Municipal Waste out of Richmond, by the way, and and then all your classic Big Four bands too. So but we also very much drew from a lot of Swedish melodic death metal bands. Like we would cover Blinded by Fear by At the Gates, episode 666 by In Flames off the Horacle album, and I like that. Like In Flames was one of my favorite bands up to and including the Clayman album, and then not after that. So one of the things I like telling people is I'm not the politician who sort of kind of likes heavy metal, or like, oh yeah, I really like that Enter the Sandman song, or some stupid crap like that. I'm like, no, I'm from the underground. Like, I was directly elected from the underground, so I am not a casual heavy metal fan. I am a thoroughbred metalhead. Like this has been my life since I was early teenager.
I sent you a note that we were going to talk about Metallica, and I said, so Delegate Roem, you've got some homework. I want you to rank the albums in terms of least favorite to most favorite. And I did that as warning, thinking that you would like need some time to put some thought to it. But like within a minute, you actually sent me your list, which I was not expecting.
She has it ready to go. Copy pasted.
Just for the record, these are full-length LP albums with no covers. These are just the original material. So this is not Garage Inc., a Garage Days revisited, the $5.98 EP from 1987, nor is this Live Ship Binge and Purge. It's not SMN1, it's not SMN2. These are just the original albums, original material.
Before we get going, it's probably important to point out to listeners, there are no truly bad Metallica albums.
There is one. Yes, there is.
There is one, Thomas.
Okay, well, the individual music may or may not float everybody's boat, but the origin story for each album is fascinating. The time period shifts, generally speaking. But let's get going, starting with number 10.
Number 10, Last Place Comes Saint Anger, came out in 2003. I was 18 years old. I was so excited that now that I was like fully fledged, complete total metalhead, that Metallica was releasing a full-length album of original material for the first time since 97, and I was just like, oh my God. So I ran into the Best Buy off of Sudley Road in Manassas, got right to the display deck, and grabbed the copy, ran to check out. And this is the day that it was released, the hour that Best Buy opened the doors. And I ran into my car, put it in, Frantic was going, and I cranked it up, and I was just like, yes, Metallica! And I was so happy that there was new Metallica that it took a long time for me to let down my guard and start actually analyzing the production value, the lack of Kirk Hammett guitar solos.
And those drums, those horrible sounding drums.
The fact that Lars's drums sounded like a thin paint can that had been left out to rust behind an old warehouse, and that he was beating it with a mallet that was probably made out of aluminum or just like your variant Coke can. It was just like it. I was trying so hard to defend that album to the death, and I can't.
I feel like you have to give them a pass here because they were essentially going through a divorce, right? So they were getting rid of their longtime bass player and they were bringing in a new bass player, and clearly they were having some emotional issues that they were working through.
This is actually true. I told anyone who was willing to listen at the time that even once I realized that this was not a good album top to bottom, I did tell people this is a step in the right direction, whether you believe it or not. And they're like, what? How could you possibly say that? I'm like, because they're doing something they haven't done since the 80s. They're being intentionally aggressive.
So I feel like, I don't want to dump on this album too much. So just being a positive person in general, I'd like to look on the bright side of things. So there's two things about this. One is you have to give them credit for not making the Black Album Part 2, which they could have done and made millions and millions of dollars, and they didn't do that. So credit to them for that.
Well, I think that's more related to Load and Reload than it is to Saint Anger.
Yeah, that's true. But also another positive thing you could say about the album is the album cover is actually pretty cool. I like the cover.
The album cover, if I remember correctly, was in Metal Maniacs. It was voted as favorite and simultaneously least favorite album cover at the same time.
That's success. I like it.
Yeah, by the way, it was actually, and it was a Pusshead design, and typically Pusshead only did their T-shirts and stuff, so like all the skulls and like like all the stuff that you typically associate with Metallica, like iconography. That they, Pusshead's been, their artist since the 80s, but yeah, he actually did do the fist, and you'll remember that there were a lot of variant colors, like color patterns for that fist, and so I think that was just a way to get people to buy 4 copies of the same album or whatever. But whatever.
Well, you just sort of touched on something, which is Black Album Part 3 to make millions of dollars, which I see is number 9 on your list. Reload. Talk about Reload.
Sure. Okay. I will tell anyone who's willing to listen on this one that there is a fantastic song on Reload. Is the last track of the album, Fixer. Fixer falls in the same vein as Bleeding Me and Outlaw Torn, where if you put those 3 songs together, and I also mean the unencumbered by manufacturing restrictions version of Outlaw Torn, just to be clear, you can produce about trying to think off the top of my head, probably 27 solid minutes of good Metallica music from the mid-90s that you might not otherwise expect. And there's a couple other surprising gems too on Reload that I think people will also overlook. I always really liked Carpe Diem Baby. I thought that was great. And Where the Wild Things Are was actually the only song of the mid-90s era that Jason Newsted got writing credit for, and I also thought was good. He got writing credit for Blackened on Injustice for All, which we'll get to later, and he got writing credit for My Friend of Misery on the Black Album. And My Friend of Misery, by the way, his bass line that ended up on the album is slightly different from his original concept of that intro bass line too. But I would also say that you can find some good aggressive moments. And here's the thing, if you're a hardcore underground person, you'll hear a song like Fuel and you'll be like, oh, come on, that's just radio, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Oh, you haven't sped on I-66 or something else while listening to Fuel. Yes, you have. Come on, give me a break. Anytime that song comes on, or especially when it's done live, it's super fun live. That's one of those, get off your high horse and, just go and enjoy it. And not to mention, Jesus, when you have consistent double bass from Lars in the mid-90s, that's a special moment. Just take it.
Now, next on your list is something I'm going to disagree with you on. Death Magnetic. You've ranked way toward the end here at number 8. I think this is one of their strongest albums. This is one of their newer albums, came out in 2008, and It is killer. I just love this thing. Also, I love when people sort of later in their career shine, and they're not just putting out stuff to make money. They're really sort of pushing their art forward, and they continue making these very strong albums. Death Magnetic is a really amazing album.
So here's what the unfairness of a ranking of 10 to 1 is, that there is such a chasm and gulf between some of these numbers. And I would argue from 8 on, you're dealing with exceptional quality in a lot of cases. And I thought when I said that Saint Anger was a step in the right direction because they were learning how to, relearning how to become aggressive, Death Magnetic was the manifestation of that, with Robert Trujillo on bass, where they put out just really good stuff. It's Judas Kiss is on there. That Was Just Your Life, and The Line.
Day That Never Comes.
All Nightmare Long, All Nightmare Long almost has a Disposable Hero sort of feel to it. Not quite that level of technicality, but just in terms of its build-up and stuff. So, Death Magnetic. I was at the World Magnetic Tour a couple times. I was in DC and Philly, and actually, let's see, and Yankee Stadium, the Bronx for the Big Four. I got there during a Slayer set, and remember going there after work. So that was, I think, 2011. That was 10 years ago. So Yeah, look, love, and the live show during the World Magnetic Tour where they had like the green lasers coming down and everything. It was super cool. So yeah, no complaints regarding Death Magnetic. Great album.
Well, on the issue of their more recent albums, 2016's Hardwired to Self-Destruct is next on your list. Again, you have to give these people credit for consistently coming out with new albums that push their artwork forward. Hardwired to Self-Destruct, such an amazing album. It might in fact be one of my favorites. I feel like Hardwired to Self-Destruct should be toward the top of the list.
So the reason that Hardwired to Self-Destruct comes in that 7th instead of higher is because if you were to change the distortion on it, it's basically them trying to do Kill 'Em All Part 2. To some degree, but the reason it actually outpaces Death Magnetic is for one very specific reason. Spit Out the Bone is fucking amazing. That is the best stuff they've done in terms of aggressive thrash since Dyer's Eve. It is so good. And in fact, on Liquid Metal, and I very much am a subscriber. I listen to Liquid Metal every day. They actually, when they were doing their Devil's Dozen of the Decade, Spit Out the Bone came at number 1. And I was just like, hell yeah, it did. And they were kind of torn between Hardwired, or Spit Out the Bone. They made the right choice with Spit Out the Bone.
Atlas Rise is one of my favorite Metallica songs.
Atlas Rise is good, they play that one live too, which is good. And it's cool as a show. But Spit Out the Bone is Metallica style Metallica. You know what I mean? Like, so for hardcore 80s Metallica metalheads who probably haven't liked the band since the Black Album or before, they hear that, they go, oh wow.
Speaking of the Black Album, that's probably their most commercially successful of all their ventures.
Oh, not probably, absolutely. It's the most commercially successful metal album ever. And in fact, like the highest selling album of the SoundScan era. Is just, you can't overstate. It's impossible to overstate the impact of the Black Album.
Okay, so controversial question here, Delegate Roem. Did they sell out?
No. They intentionally wanted to make an album that was different from Injustice for All, because Injustice for All had gotten to this pinnacle of progressive songwriting that if you were to follow it, you would just start turning your band into Rush. You know what I mean? Like they had reached this peak of where they wanted to go with that. And so when they brought in Bob Rock, Bob wanted to strip them down more or less, like to bare parts, and really get them to just make good, heavy songs. And as they did that, who could possibly have anticipated in the writing process of that album that the Black Album would sell 15 million copies and 30 years later would still be on a Billboard Top 200 chart? If you are going to intentionally sell out on a record, it's going to be a flash in the pan. It's going to show up, it'll exist, and it goes away, right? The Black Album's legacy has endured for 30 years now. And it's just, even Tom Araya from Slayer will be like, oh, I mean, like, they were putting out Season of the Abyss while Metallica was putting out the Black Album. So like Slayer was still very much being Slayer, but they're like, look, you can't fault someone who puts out the most successful metal album ever. You can't.
Speaking of successful metal albums, the number 5 on your list.
Hey, I'm not done with number 6 though. One thing.
Okay. Cool.
Okay. My Friend of Misery, as previously mentioned, and The God That Failed. The reason this comes in at number 6 and where it is those two songs. I don't care who you are in terms of like, oh, well, I don't like Enter Sandman. I don't like, Saboteur, whatever. Those two songs are perfect. They are just heavy. And The God That Failed, lyrically, about James's mother refusing treatment and then dying because of being a Christian Science follower, he went really emotionally raw in the writing of those lyrics, and that resonated with me so much. I loved the intensity of the lyric writing and his voice in doing it. And My Friend of Misery, I mean, if you've ever just been down or frustrated by, just people being down around you, oh my God, My Friend of Misery is just perfectly heavy. I love it. I love that song.
Now, I'm going to have to take issue here with your next highest album here.
Yeah, everyone will.
At number 5, explain this. You've ranked Load above Death Magnetic. You've ranked Load above Hardwired to Self-Destruct. Explain yourself.
This is it. They're the two songs I mentioned earlier, Bleeding Me and The Outlaw Torn, aren't just good songs on an otherwise mediocre album. They are so exceptional. They are my two favorite Metallica songs. And you're like, what? Your favorite songs are from Load? Like, surprisingly, yes. Bleeding Me and Outlaw Torn have like kind of rotated in my mind for 20 some odd years now about like which is like my favorite in that moment. And just as soon as like Bleeding Me starts, the hair will start rising on my arms. And I remember seeing the Outlaw Torn live in Albany at the Pepsi Center in 2004. And it was just like that was almost like a dream come true to see that live. Bleeding Me is a little bit more than 8 minutes, and the unencumbered by manufacturing restrictions version of Outlaw Torn is pushing 11 minutes. And the journey those songs take you on, James's vocal melodies, the Kirk solos, is so just entrancing, and it will just take you into another universe. And the funny thing is, and this is true with Bleeding Me especially, all right, because like I said before, I come from the underground, okay? Like I talk to people, and like my friends are people who are really into like Napalm Death, grindcore bands in general, and bands with names that I can't even say on air. Like super.
It's a podcast. You can say anything.
Oh, I could, but like I also like being elected. So like I like just say like just think of the most aggressive bands you could possibly think of. Like those are my friends, okay? And then you say, "Hey, Bleeding Me," and they're like, "Oh, it's so good."
At number 4, you've got one of probably my second favorite Metallica album of all time, Kill 'Em All. It's how I discovered Metallica by raiding the records in my parents' basement.
Nice.
Yeah. So and that's how I found that. So let's talk about number 4, Kill 'Em All.
All right, so here's the thing. You could rank these top 4 in whatever order, and it's completely defensible. So like there's like 3 tiers more or less. Like Saint Anger Reload has that tier, then kind of that middle one. These 4 are like, this is the quintessential Metallica, right? So my favorite song on Kill 'Em All is No Remorse. It's so much thrash, and it's so good that even Cannibal Corpse covered it on the Gore-Obsessed album. And I remember seeing Cannibal Corpse at Jack's in April 2002. The front row collapsed like 30 seconds into Savage Butchery, and like it was just like such an intense crowd. And meanwhile, like my friends and I are all yelling "No Remorse" because we wanted to hear the cover. But I mean, like Kill 'Em All is just, it's not the invention of thrash metal, but it kick-drived it. When they were going on the Kill 'Em All for One out tour with Raven in like 83, the people showing up, you just didn't get this amount of aggression at metal shows at the time, like on a consistent basis. You just didn't see it. And Metallica had tapped into something so special that even the drummer of Paul from Cannibal Corpse, he's like, when he first heard Kill 'Em All, it was too heavy for him. He didn't get into the band until Ride the Lightning because his taste had evolved a little bit by that point. But it was groundbreaking, and it's still timeless. That album's 38 years old now and is still timeless. And by the way, product of Central New York. I went to college in Western New York. So fun fact.
Seek and Destroy is one of my favorites.
Yeah, I was in a metal band in high school, quote unquote metal band in high school that actually covered Seek and Destroy for a high school talent show or something like that. So,
nice.
I have a big affinity for that one. Let's talk about number 3, Ride the Lightning, which has one of my favorite songs, For Whom the Bell Tolls.
I wanted to introduce this segment with that awesome beginning of For Whom the Bell Tolls, with the bell and the guitars come in, but I did, like I said,
longer than 10 seconds.
I didn't want Lars to come after me with the lawsuit, but yeah, Ride the Lightning.
So my college band actually covered both From the Bell Tolls and Creeping Death. And I'll tell you this, if SMN2 got anything really done right, it was From the Bell Tolls. I thought From the Bell Tolls, like, SMN1 is up and down, I think, like a better of the two albums, but SMN2, like, From the Bell Tolls is really good. Like, the xylophonist going crazy was just amazing. But this is an album where top to bottom, it's just, you're now in the territory of Metallica albums where everything's perfect top to bottom. And in Ride the Lightning's case, I think that it was still a little less developed technically than you'll have on, the top two albums here. But I also think that you had a sonic explosion when Fight Fire with Fire kicks in. This was elevating Metallica to, like, okay, you have a fast thrash band that wrote Whiplash and Metal Militia, where can they take this sound to? And then Fight Fire kicks in after the soft intro where it's like, it sounds like, the nuclear blast goes off. And, and I think that intro was meant to be kind of like the Daisy ad, where, it's like, just soft in the field and then boom. And from that moment on, that album is just like, it melts your face, while at the same time, the first time Metallica ever got accused of selling out was for Fade to Black. All the way back in 1984 was the first time they were told, like, oh, you guys went soft. It's like, Jesus Christ, that was a song about suicide. You gotta be kidding. And when Jason Newsted's last ever performance with Metallica was, it was actually live on VH1, and they played one song, and it was voted on by the fans, and as Jason would say, appropriately, it was Fade to Black. And so even though that was obviously a Cliff Burton song, I think that song has an emotional resonance with Metallica fans more so than any other song in their catalog, because it is so real and so incredibly crafted. The songwriting is just mind-numbing. And also, by the way, just one other song to highlight on there, their Grammy winner for the Call of Cthulhu, which actually got the Grammy for the SMN one version of it, from '99. I think that's a really special moment, because that was the first time in a full songwriting context, other than like not because like Anesthesia Pulling Teeth from Kill 'Em All from Cliff was very much like the Cliff Burton show. He really showed like what his songwriting can do musically that is so different from any other bass player at the time.
And then next on the list is one of the best albums ever made, Master of Puppets.
Oh, it's the best
Orion,
album.
Damage Incorporated,
yeah.
Leper Messiah. I mean, just really not a dull moment on this thing. Really amazing stuff.
Oh yeah, like this tops everyone's list for greatest metal albums of all time for a reason. It is. And my favorite happens to be different from their best. Master of Puppets is the best Metallica album, period. It is my second favorite Metallica album, but I will distinguish, like, and I do this for a few other bands, like A Predator's Portrait from Soilwork is Soilwork's best album, but my favorite is Natural Born Chaos, for example. So, this happens, but Master of Puppets, what else is there to say? They achieve perfection. The song Master of Puppets is the greatest heavy metal song of all time, and that is immediately followed by Rain and Blood by Slayer. Although Jose Mangin will put Walk by Pantera second, but I'll put Rain and Blood second. And then you have the actual gem of Cliff Burton's career in Orion that was so profound as an instrumental, they actually played that at Cliff's funeral in 1986.
All right, so we got to wrap this up so that we don't go on ridiculously long. But let's talk about one of the best albums ever made. I've just got a place in my heart for And Justice for All. What is it about this album that's just so amazing?
This is my number one. This is absolutely my number one. And I think with Injustice for All, when I was a kid or teenager and I saw the one video, and I think this is really universal, this is the second time Metallica was accused of selling out, because they used to say like, oh, we'll never do an MTV music video. Well, when the time was right, they did it for one, and I will still argue that is the greatest heavy metal video you will ever see in your life. It is low-key, low budget. They used a bunch of clips from Johnny Got His Gun, and it will give you chills. It's impossible not to get goosebumps when you listen to the voice that says, like when he's doing Morse code with his head, he's bouncing up and down, and the guy translates it and he goes, what's he saying? Kill me, over and over again, kill me. It's just, I'm like, even right now I'm saying it, and the goosebumps are coming up on my arms right now as I'm talking, just thinking about it. That's what the thought of the video of that song is, let alone the fact that it has Kirk Hammett's greatest guitar solo ever, let alone that Blackened, when you get to see that, open a Metallica show, or like in FedEx Field 2003 when they came back, from the encore with Blackened. Oh my God, Blackened is just, it has all the technicality of Damage Inc. and Battery and, all the other classic thrashers. And then it takes it to the next level. The critique of this album, of course, is that the bass was too low. And this is why it will never be the best metal album ever, because the production was not like that.
Production value here is so disappointing because it's such an amazing album, but it suffers from this horrible production value.
That is actually Lars's fault, more so than the mixer, and the mixer will say that he will say that to the death to this day. So it's not like I don't blame Fleming Rasmussen or anyone for it, but what I will say though is, in terms of its songwriting, James Hetfield demonstrated himself, in my opinion, to be parallel to Tony Iommi with his guitar majesty. And keep in mind, Kirk only records the leads. James puts down all of the rhythm, every layer of that rhythm. James's creative songwriting at that point, if you listen to The Frayed Ends of Sanity, if you listen to the song Injustice for All, and you're really piecing this together, you're going through this level of technicality of songwriting in the world of thrash that is unparalleled. You don't have progressive thrash like that, where you could have time signature changes and everything to such an intense level. And then my favorite thrash song ever, Dyer's Eve. That's, dear mother, dear father, what is this hell you have put me through? Believer, deceiver, day in, day out, I live my life. You pushed onto me. What's wrong? All right. Hidden from this thing that they call life. That's intense and raw. And when you're in high school and you hear that, and I'll never be someone who ever says negative stuff about my mom. My mom did, she went through hell to have to raise her kids after my dad killed himself in 1987. But hearing that, and the dear father part on that too, and feeling that alienation, that was raw and that was real. And that songwriting from James Hetfield, I thought, tapped into something that will always make him relatable, and that he had a broken childhood, and that I could understand in that regard. And then when you get into To Live Is to Die, those lyrics, the very few lyrics that are on there, and the spoken word part from Hetfield, that was written by Cliff Burton. And that's also really special, because that was like the farewell from Cliff. When a man lies, he murders some part of the world. These are the true deaths which men must call their lives. All this I cannot bear to witness any longer. Cannot the kingdom of salvation take me home? That's off the top of my head, by the way. I don't have that open up my screen or anything.
Well, And Justice
Beautiful.
for All works as the theme for this entire episode, based off the legislation we talked about earlier and the ranking of your favorite Metallica albums. So please subscribe to Transition Virginia wherever pods are cast. You can follow the Transition team on Twitter at TransitionVA, and find us on the web at transitionvirginia.com. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you can enjoy our next episode of Transition Virginia.
I knew Michael was a metalhead the first time I saw him. He had the chain.
The chain and the motorcycle boots that he walks around in.
Yeah, the aesthetic was there. What I would call metalhead formal. It was there.
What do millions of Americans and 3 former U.S. presidents have in common? They all agree that Boll & Branch sheets are the softest, most comfortable sheets in the world. Boll & Branch cotton is rain-fed, pesticide-free, and carries the highest organic certification. That's why it's so soft. Boll & Branch sheets start at just $160. They're $1,000 quality for a fraction of the price. Plus, you can sleep on them for a month, risk-free. That's BOLL and branch.com. Restrictions may apply. See bollandbranch.com for details.